Pwnc ni heno yma ydy cymharu Cymru a'r Alban, diwylliant, Cymdeithas Cyfle ac annibyniaeth. So mae'n bwnc enfawr, ac felly da ni eisiau cychwyn, achos mae'n bwnc hynod ddiddorol. Fel da ni gyd yn gwybod, mae annibyniaeth i bod yn symud yn ei flaen yn yr Alban ac yng Nghymru. Ond mae'r ddwy wlad wedi cymryd llwybra tra wahanol. Felly mae'n ddiddorol iawn meddwl amdano beth yw'r gwahaniaethau yna, pam bod ni'n gwneud pethau'n wahanol, a sut mae hynna'n effeithio arno ni. Dwi'n gwybod yng Nghymru yn aml, da ni'n edrych i'r Alban fel gwlad sydd chydig bach yn fwy ymlaen ar ei taith tuag at annibyniaeth. Ond be mae hynna'n olygu a pa berthynas sydd gan hynny efo sut ydyn ni wedi bod yn wneud yn diwylliant a sut ydyn ni wedi bod yn expresio'n hynna'n yn diwylliannol. Felly, yn syth bin, dwi'n meddwl, benau ydy gofyn i pawb yn unigol gyflwyno eu hunan. Pwy ydych chi o ran y siaradwyr? Pam bo chi yn teimlo fod y pwnc yma ddiddordeb. Yr unig beth na i sôn cyn i ni fynd ymlaen ydy mae gennym ni dipyn o siaradwyr, felly os ydych chi'n hapus i gadw fo'n gynnil, fysa ni yn falch iawn o hynny. Bod peth ydych chi'n dweud o ddiddordeb i ni wrth gwrs. Na i ddechrau efo Rory. Rory, could you introduce yourself quickly to us, please, and a little bit about your relationship with this topic?
That me? Yes.
Yes, please.
Yeah, hi, my name's Rory Scothorne. I am a writer and write for like the New Statesman, The Guardian, and also a historian. Just finished a PhD on the relationship between the radical left and Scottish nationalism from the 60s to the 80s. So with a particular emphasis on the role of culture, broadly speaking, particularly like intellectuals, and the way in which people moved from engaging with culture into engaging with politics, and particularly kind of a growing preoccupation in Scotland with the relationship between culture and politics, the way in which they kind of cross-pollinate. And I think it's still a really important topic. Obviously, I think I'm a socialist. I think any successful socialist strategy has to mobilize people by tapping into their kind of everyday cultural values and experiences. So I think any kind of left-wing politics, any kind of left-wing nationalism has to have a really close and careful understanding of how culture is functioning politically, and also how politics is transforming culture at the same time.
Yes, a really interesting subject in your PhD. It actually sounds really interesting as well. So I'm really looking forward to hearing you speak tonight, Rory. Thank you. Harriet, can we come to you next, please? And can you tell us a little bit about yourself? And I'm really interested to think about how your culture has affected your decision to move into politics, especially with Momentum, which is usually thought of as quite a young activist group, and how that feeds back into your culture and your expression then.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I'm Harriet. I guess I'm interested in this because I've lived in Scotland and both Wales, and was in Scotland during the time of the referendum. So I think that kind of shapes a lot of my politics that I've brought here to Wales now. In terms of Momentum doesn't have a position on independence, just going to put that out there. But yeah, really, it's really interesting to see how different sections of the left engage in this discussion, actually. And I usually find it quite difficult to have this discussion with a lot of the particularly English left. So I think it is, yeah, a really interesting point for us now. But yeah, I didn't write an opening speech, guys, so I'm just making this up. But hi, I'm Harriet.
That's the best way usually. Thank you, Harriet. Sioned, ga I ddod ata chdi os gwelwch yn dda? Ti bellach yn aelod o'r Senedd ac yn wleidydd proffesiynol, a sut mae hynna'n effeithio ar dy berthynas di efo gwleidyddiaeth ac hefyd efo'r ffordd i chdi dyfu fyny yn expresio dy wleidyddiaeth drwy dy ddiwylliant?
Diolch Elin. Ie, wel mae'n rôl newydd i fi, dim ond ers mis Mai dwi wedi bod yn wleidydd proffesiynol, ond dwi'n meddwl bod fy nhaith at wleidyddiaeth falle'n adlewyrchu rhai o'r pethau fyddwn ni'n trafod heno, nes i hyfforddi fel newyddiadurwr, a nes i wneud y penderfyniad i i wneud hynny drwy gyfrwng y Gymraeg, i weithio drwy gyfrwng y Gymraeg yng Nghymru, yn hollol fwriadol, achos o'n i'n gweld y ffram Gymreig a Chymraeg yna yn gwbl hanfodol i ddatblygiad a y ffordd i ni'n meithrin ac yn mynegu ein hunaniaeth ni ac ein hiaith ni. Am flynyddoedd, wel, ein diwylliant a'n llenyddiaeth a'n iaith oedd yr unig ffordd roeddwn ni'n gallu mynegu ein hunaniaeth ni gwleidyddol gyda egfach falle. A mae wedi bod yn ddiddorol gweld ers datganoli sut mae hynny wedi datblygu a newid ac sut mae'r berthynas rhwng y gwleidyddiaeth egfach yna, y hunaniaeth yna i ni'n mynegu trwy ein diwylliant ni, wedi troi yn wleidyddiaeth a'r berthynas yna gyda gwleidyddiaeth egfawr. Felly ie, o'n i hefyd wrth gwrs cyn cael fy ethol yn adolygydd proffesiynol oedd e ddim yn ddigon i dalu'r biliau, achos dwi ddim yn mewn diwylliannau lleiafrifol, ond felly dwi wedi bod ynghlwm yn y ffordd yna gyda'n diwylliant ni, ac wedi gweld am llygad yn hunain sut mae datganoli a sut mae y ffordd oedd y ti'n sôn ar y dechrau, sut ni wedi bod yn edrych tuag at yr Alban a'r ffordd nath yr hyn ddigwyddodd yn sgil referendum 2014, sut mae hynny wedi ysbrydoli falle ac effeithio ar ein ymarferwyr diwylliannol ni. Felly ie, dyna fy stori.
Ie, mae'n rili diddorol, dydy. Bethan, mae Bethan efo ni heno yma o Gymdeithas yr Iaith. A mae Cymdeithas yr Iaith, fel ni'n gwybod, wedi bod yn hynod lwyddiannus ar y cychwyn cyntaf yn plethu diwylliant ag gwleidyddiaeth. Felly, Bethan, ti eisiau cyflwyno dy hun yn sydyn iawn ac wedyn, ie, deithon ni chydig bach amdan sut mae'r Gymdeithas yn gweithredu yn ddiwylliannol.
Wel, ie, y peth darodd fi gyntaf oedd, mae'n ystodorol bod ni'n gweud bod yna ddiwylliant o ymgyrchu yng Nghymru. Mae hwnna'n fel yn ffris sy'n cael ei ddefnyddio yn diwylliant o ymgyrchu. So mae ymgyrchu bron yn diwylliant yn ei hunan, ond wrth gwrs mae diwylliant yn gymaint yn ohono fe, achos os ewn ni nôl at ddechreuad Cymdeithas yr Iaith, 1962, darlith Saunders Lewis nath ysbrydoli, sefydlu Cymdeithas yr Iaith, bardd a dramodydd wrth gwrs, diwylliant fyna ar dechrau, un o gadaryddion cynnar yn Cymdeithas yr Iaith, Dafydd Iwan, yn ybyddus iawn am ei gyneuon protest sydd yn, wel, boblogaidd ac yn enwog o hyd. So mae diwylliant na wedi bod yn bron yn rhan o'r ymgyrchu o'r dechrau, ni'n teimlo.
Ond dwi'n rhan hollol anatod mewn ffordd yn dydy.
Ydy.
Wel, ti'n teimlo bod hynna wedi galluogi i y syniad yma o ymgyrchu a wedi bron iawn gwarchod yr ymgyrchu a'r neges wrth iddo fo fynd o un cenhedlaeth i'r nesaf bellach a bod ddiwylliant wedi cario hwnna efo fo mewn ffordd arbennig iawn. Bethan?
Sori. Ond, ie, i raddau, achos mae'r Gymdeithas fyd, ni'n trefnu gigs bob blwyddyn, so mae'r elfennau o ddiwylliant dal yn bwysig, a un o'r rhesymau ni'n trefnu gigs yw mwyn tynnu pobl sydd falle ddim yn gweld eu hunan yn wleidyddol, yn dod i bethau diwylliannol, a maen nhw, ni'n trio cyflwyno gwleidyddiaeth, ddim yn unig trwy fondiau gwleidyddol, ond ni'n neud yn siŵr bod yna neges gwleidyddol yn y gigs yn trwle mewn rhyw ffordd. Mae'n gallu bod yn anodd, ond na'r bwriad, cael pobl mewn i wleidyddiaeth trwy ddiwylliant bron heb bod nhw'n sylwi, achos mae pobl yn meddwl am wleidyddiaeth fel rhywbeth sych, diflas, ond stelwch chi gig, mae'n lot fwy diddorol a chyffroes, os ydych chi'n cael bach o wleidyddiaeth mewn yn hwnna fyd. Falle, newch chi weld bod wleidyddiaeth ddim cweit mor diflas a chi'n meddwl.
Ie, gwe. Diolch, Bethan. Katie, can we come to you and can I ask you to introduce yourself and your relationship with this topic as well, please?
Was that to me? I missed the start there, Elin, just because I was listening to the translation.
Sorry, could you introduce yourself to everyone here and your relationship with this topic? If that's
sure, no worries. Thank you very much for having me. My name's Katie Gallogly Swan. I am not an expert on this topic, I would say. I work in global climate policy, but a million moons ago, I wrote a research work on looking at I suppose the connection between culture, class and identity in Scotland, and I think that that's maybe where I'm specifically interested in this topic. I was an independent supporter myself back in 2014, and I think that in Scotland, and maybe this is the case in Wales as well, but there's often a lot of conflation between working class identity and cultural identity of Scottishness, and there's lots of contradictions and complications in there about regional issues, gender issues, all sorts of things that go on. But this research piece looking at language and music around about the referendum and the sort of deployment of working class registers and working class language in songs, and I suppose I'm interested in how the risks of this conflation between class and culture, and how that, you know, as a socialist myself who would want a socialist independence, how that can limit or recruit, you know, limit the radical potential of an independence as these sort of more radical voices get recruited into national projects. But yeah, I to echo what Rory was saying, you know, I think that you know, radical movements or movement building has to start from where people are, and you know, my own research back in the day started from where I was, which was feeling very much Scottish, but realizing that there were some class connections there as well, that hadn't really been mined or hadn't really been surfaced in a way that could clarify the class conflict in Scotland itself. So I feel very strongly that, like, being able to understand and identify sort of mass culture isn't something, you know, not as something to be looked down upon, but as a starting point for political movements.
Yes, that's really interesting. Yes, definitely. We're going to have a discussion now with a number of questions to try and explore this topic further, because it's clearly something that is essential to our political life. So dwi'n mynd I fynd yn syth I mewn i'r cwestiynau sydd gennym ni heno yma, a dwi'n mynd I ofyn y cwestiynau yn Gymraeg, a mae'r cyfieithu yna, felly mae croeso I bawb ar yn panel ni gyfrannu yn y Gymraeg neu yn y Saesneg. Yn cwestiwn cyntaf ni fyswn ni'n licio trafod ydy, pa mor gwleidyddol ydy diwylliant Cymru a'r Alban mewn gwirionedd, a sut mae hynna yn rhan o'n celfyddydau ni'n cerddoriaeth ni a'n llenyddiaeth ni. A sut mae hyn wedi datblygu dros y degawdau. Mae'n siŵr yn benodol ydy sut mae'r gwleidyddiaeth diwylliannol yma yn gwrthsefyll yr diwylliant mwyaf frifol sydd gennym ni yn yr Alban yng Nghymru ac ym Mhrydain I gyd. Os da rwy'n eisiau neidio mewn a dechrau'r drafodaeth yna? Harriet?
Yeah, I can. Excuse me. Okay, so when I was thinking about this, I thought about it would be really, really easy for us to homogenize both Scottish and Welsh culture and then just compare them. And I don't think that would be a good use of our time, because I think it's much more complex than that. So I think there are like two key points to this discussion. Number one is that I'm going to talk about Wales in particular, obviously not going to talk about Scotland right now, sorry guys. The Welsh culture isn't homogeneous. And number two, I think that culture ebbs and flows. And I think the perfect example is the first time I ever watched The Dragon Has Two Tongues. It made complete sense to me. And I think it perfectly sums up this division where you've got like industrial working class of the south, majority English language, high migration patterns, the more rural agrarian working class of the west, majority Welsh language, and then the north, more closer to England metropolitan centres like Liverpool and Manchester, right? Now that's a very crude way of looking at it, but we can kind of see these differences, and then that all plays out in electoral politics, right? So like south mainly being Labour, west mainly being Plaid, and the north now shifting to some Tory seats, which is mind-blowing. And where I think some of this division comes from as well, and the key factor here, is language. Now, I think that this is going to be the key difference when we're comparing Welsh and Scottish culture, is the effect of the language. Now, I don't speak Welsh, and I definitely need to learn, guys. And I think, you know, this is where the kind of ebb and flow comes in as well, is that currently, I think Welsh political culture currently is way less political than Scotland. I think Scotland has had like a hangover of the Scottish referendum where everyone got really politically educated. And I think that's kind of like bled into the...
It is full on and I need to get...
Claire, can you mute yourself? Yeah, no worries, she's muted. And I think in Wales, we've kind of developed a huge complacency where we haven't had that like shot of adrenaline like the Scots have around the Scottish referendum. And that kind of like utopic thinking that was born of the Scottish referendum. When it comes to like music, art and culture in Wales, I don't really see that utopic thinking. I don't really see that kind of revolutionary aspect. And I think that's where this comes into the difference, is that it probably does happen in Welsh language music and literature, but because I don't speak well, I don't see it. So this is why there's the kind of division that I wanted to highlight from the beginning. Going to stop talking, lots of hands up now.
Sioned, gael mynd I chdi nesaf, sgwch dda.
Diolch, ie. Wrth gwrs, yn derbyn nifer o'r pwyntiau yna mae Harriet yn neud, ond beth mae fy mydolaeth I fy hunan hefyd yn herio y thesis yna, achos dwi'n rhywun sy'n yn dod o'r de-ddwyrain a ddim yn rhywun sy'n ffitio i'r mowld yna o ran y mowd gwleidyddol yna, o ran pa fath o berson o ba fath o ddiwylliant sy'n dod o pa fath o ran o'r wlad. Felly, jyst eisiau tynnu sylw yn cytuno gyda ti, dyw diwylliant Cymreig a Chymraeg ddim yn un blob monolithaidd, ond mae yna amrywiaethau o fewn rheina hefyd, a mae hynny'n bwysig I gydnabod. A dwi'n meddwl hefyd mae Dragon has two tongues, mae hwnna yn amlwg yn perthyn I gyfnod. A oedd e'n wir, a mae yna wirioneddau sy'n dal I fod yn aros ers hynny, ond dwi yn meddwl ers datganoli bod ni wedi gweld y ddwy ddiwylliant yn agosáu at I gilydd. Mae Athro David Johnson yn ei gyfrol Welsh Literature gyhoeddwyd yn ddiweddar yn dweud bod e'n teimlo yn fwy nag erioed bod y ddau draddodiad yna yn dylanwadu ar ei gilydd lawer mwy na maen nhw wedi o'r blaen, a dwi'n meddwl am bethau fel y Theatr Genedlaethol enghraifft, lle pan sefydlwyd nhw o'r National Theatre Wales a'r Theatr Genedlaethol Cymru, and never the twain shall meet. Wel, ni'n gwybod nawr, mae yna gyd cynhyrchu yn digwydd, mae yna ap sibrwd yn rhoi mynediad I bobl I medru dod nhw mewn i'r ddwy ddiwylliant, a mae dylanwad y Gymraeg hefyd ar gynnyrch diwylliannol Saesneg Iaith, Cymreig a Saesneg Iaith yn digwydd lawer mwy hefyd. Felly, jyst eisiau herio hynny tipyn bach o'n I.
Can I ask you, Harriet? You mentioned the divisions there, and that these divisions have been highlighted for generations between North and South, West and East, Welsh language, English language. How much do you think it's a symptom of our political situation that we identify with the differences between us instead of those things that join us together and that bring us together? And if we were a culture of one language or of a majority language and no equally recognised other language, do you think that those divisions would still exist but we wouldn't concentrate on them?
Is this for me?
Yeah.
Like the riposte from Sioned is totally fair, but I think when we're talking about Welsh culture, I feel like there's a whole section of Welsh culture that I've like not experienced because of the language, and that's just a fact. That's not a judgment. For example, I didn't know who Dafydd Iwan was. I didn't know what Ymgyrchwyr o Hyd was until like 2 years ago, whereas for Welsh lang speakers, it's like Champagne Supernova level famous, whereas I was like totally unaware of this kind of stuff. So I think sadly there is like I don't have a judgment on whether it's a positive or a negative division, and I wouldn't see it as that because I don't care, you know, like whatever language you speak, croeso, you know. It's more that I think that does exist when we talk about culture and identity in particular in Wales. Yeah, I hope that answers your point.
Yeah, no, yeah, it does definitely, yeah. Rory, can I come to you, and then Katie, I'll come to you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, really fascinating start. Also absolutely love The Dragon Has Two Tongues. I think I was just trying to work out how many tongues Scotland's dragon has, except we have a unicorn, and unfortunately it only has one horn. What I mean by that is that Scotland is technically, I mean, it is very much a multilingual country. We have at least 3 official languages. We've got Scots, English, and Gaelic. But the interesting thing, I mean, Gaelic obviously has there are still speakers and so on, but it's not really at the kind of forefront of Scots culture. Yes, absolutely, and Doric, and there are all sorts of debates we can have about how many there really are. But the thing about Scots is that the way it's mostly used in Scottish culture now, certainly in mainstream Scottish culture, is that Scots is something that is pretty much mutually intelligible with English, the way it's publicized, at least, as something that's accessible to really anyone, at least anyone in Scotland. And one of the interesting differences there with what Harriet was saying is that you know, it allows for this like code switching, really. And so rather than having a kind of what you might describe as a sort of plebeian code, this kind of special code that Welsh speakers have, within which they can cultivate a nationalism like without interference from the outside almost, and which gives you a kind of fairly powerful in-group identity, I think. Scots is almost dangerously accessible on the flip side. Almost anyone can come in and just learn Scots and start speaking it with considerably less effort, I think, than Welsh. Certainly to the point that it's generally used in Scottish culture. Now, the politics of that, I think, are probably that this leaves Scots very open to middle-class appropriation, despite the fact that it's largely associated with the working class. I'm conscious that the person who's written one of the best books on this is in the event, Scott Hames. So at some point you should come to him, and I'm plagiarizing him shamelessly here. But the key thing is that Scots is used to kind of authenticate the middle class. This is Scott's argument. But Scots is used to really authenticate the middle class, or the radicalism of the middle class, to say we have this like democratic basis because we speak Scots as well as English.
Rory, how much do you see a reflection of that in Welsh culture?
Well, I think Welsh seems to, I mean, as not an expert on, you know, the Welsh language politics at all, I'm sure there is a similar thing, but the difference is that, of course, that you can speak to English speakers in Scots and they'll get quite a lot of it. In the way that it's used, obviously there's forms of Scots that are harder to get into. In the way that it's generally used in Scottish popular culture, you can speak it in a way where pretty much anyone in Scotland who speaks English will recognise most of what you're saying, but they'll go, oh, that's like a kind of working class way of speaking. And so it'll give you a kind of authenticity. And I don't think that kind of trick is available in Welsh nationalism in the same way. Certainly not with Welsh language itself. So there's an interesting political difference there in the sense that it really can empower basically established forces in Scottish society if we invest the Scots language with like an intrinsically radical or democratic quality. So there's a real paradox.
That's really interesting, yeah. Katie, do you want to come in?
Sure. I agree with a lot of what Rory said there, but I also disagree with some of it as well, because I think that Scots is less accessible than he makes it out to be. You know, my partner comes from a middle class background in Edinburgh, and often things I say are completely unintelligible to him because I come from a different region in Scotland. So I think that maybe he's taken liberties there with like the regional differences. No offense, Rory, but I think that this question of like Scots in the run up to the referendum, as an example, the Scottish government financed this website called I Speak Scots. I was obviously spelled AYE, and it had clips of recordings of people speaking from different places in Scotland, and it was like the whole point was to be like, and you speak Scots too, and you could understand all of these different snippets of language. So there is a lot of like the way that Scots has been attempted to be sort of deployed in that sort of politicized way. But I think that there is still an in-group experience of that. When I think of, I remember this moment, I was at a party in London with a group of pals, mostly Scottish, but we were talking about Limmy, and the really nice fella who was English, tried to like say his analysis of Limmy, and you could have heard a pin drop. They were all like, no, you're talking rubbish, that's not what that joke's about. So there is still this like kind of in-group experience of these sort of popular culture things. But and Rory and I were having a wee chat beforehand about what is the representation of like Scottishness in culture, and it is like, it is Limmy, it's the Proclaimers, it's Billy Connolly, which tends to be a sort of lower register of culture if you're thinking in terms of artistic hierarchies that are often very class oriented as well. And then you've also got, at the same time, again, noting that Scott is on the call, so I'm about to wade into his territory, but like literary nationalism and this sort of, these two ends of like a kind of masturbatory sort of Scottish culture of like, that could be sort of, cohere with an SNP party broadcast. It's this romanticised idea of like Scottish political culture, not naming names and what those are. And then on the other side, you've got this sort of like real Scottish grit sort of output, which, is again, not really for working class people, but really about middle class, sort of masochistic, sort of like, yeah, this is what we're like, we're really gritty, and this is the real background of Scotland, even though they've not really experienced that, or even though it's actually, maybe it lacks the humanity of working class experiences, or it's a sort of poverty porn expedition. So this kind of like gets to, I think, this question of like authenticity, and some of this stuff around language is really about who gets the chance to speak and who has the right to speak, who's real and who's not real, which obviously has loads of implications for migrants, never mind people who might not fit the sort of idea of what the classic Scottishness is. I certainly grew up thinking Rabsy Nisbet was the height of Scottishness, and when I would meet people from outside the Central Belt, which is where I grew up, my understanding was like, they're not very Scottish, that's not Scottish. And it very much was imbued in this linguistic register of who sounds like that. And I suppose that's maybe what I was trying to get at, like the way that class and culture and language and it all gets sort of melded together in Scotland, and kind of often deployed really to conceal those differences and to conceal class conflict. And this, when you do get working class outputs that are cultural outputs, they tend to still be stuck in this sort of the excitement, the thrill of having yourself represented. That person sounds like me, rather than actually, like the quality of the output itself, if that makes sense. I've rambled on a wee bit, so I'll stop.
No, that makes really good sense. Sioned a Bethan, cyn I fi ddod ata chi, I'm just going to mention to everybody here, and I just sôn wrth pawb sydd yma'n gwrando, da ni'n mynd I gael cyfle ar diwedd y drafodaeth I chi gyd ofyn cwestiwn ac I chi gyd ymuno efo'r drafodaeth. Felly, os oes posib I chi gadw'ch cwestiynau tan y diwedd, fysa hynna'n wych. Mae gennym ni hefyd y chat, a mae croeso I chi roi cwestiynau yna, ond nawn ni ddod I hynna gobeithio tua 7:10 munud wedi 7. Richard, I can see your hand up, so I'm hoping that you've been able to catch up on what I just mentioned then about asking questions at the end. Sioned a Bethan, dwi'n siŵr iawn pwy oedd y gynta. Dwi'n meddwl na Sioned oedd o, felly nac I Beth. Ar yn sgrin I, mae Sioned ochr yma a mae Bethan ochr yma, so mae Sioned newydd bwyntio off y sgrin a mae Bethan newydd bwyntio off y sgrin ochr arall. Nawn ni mynd efo Bethan gynta ta, os di hynna'n oce efo chi. Achos mae'n eitha diddorol os fedra ni gymharu dy brofiad di efo profiad oedd Katie'n siarad amdano, a dwi'n meddwl bod hynna'n gymhariaeth eitha diddorol am hynna.
Ie, fi'n meddwl mae Sioned efo gynta, so diolch Sioned. Ond ie, jyst I fynd ôl at y sgwrs dosbarth canol, dosbarth gweithiol. O ran y Gymraeg yn bendant, mae'r Gymraeg yn amlwg, dyw e ddim yn perthyn i'n dosbarth. Mae fe wastad wedi bod yn iaith y pyllau glo, mae wedi bod ar y ffarm, mae wedi bod yn iaith y dosbarth canol. Ond eto mae diwylliant, erbyn hyn fi'n teimlo lot o beth, bod, a wedi bod yn enwedig falle yn fwy dros blynyddau, mae diwylliant Gymraeg yn rhywbeth mwy dosbarth canol, neu o leia mae'n cael ei weld fel rhywbeth mwy dosbarth canol. A fi'n meddwl mae ymgyrchu hefyd wedi cael ei weld fel rhywbeth mwy dosbarth canol. A fi'n meddwl bod hwnna yn rhannol achos bod wel, dechreuodd yr mudiad protest, really, trwy gyferwyr coleg, oedd yn amlwg yn mynd i fod yn dosbarth canol. Nawr mae addysg, dyw e ddim yn rhywbeth dosbarth canol ragor. So fi'n meddwl bod hwnna, mae hwnna'n amlwg yn byth da, ond mae hwnna'n golygu wedyn, falle bod diwylliant, falle bod ymgyrchu ddim yn rhywbeth môr dosbarth canol. A jyst yn ôl at yr elfen o dosbarth canol a diwylliant. Fi'n meddwl un o'r enghreifftiau gorau diweddar sy'n dangos bod e ddim yn ddosbarth canol yw mae dyn ni broblem tai, a mae fe'n effeithio pob man ar draws Cymru. Mae hwnna yn fater sy'n berthnasol dosbarth gweithiol. A na beth sydd gyda ni ar hyn o bryd yw, mae 3 band yn ddiweddar, mae Rory Evans Bwca a Lewis wedi bod yn canu am broblem tai yn lleol iddyn nhw. Ewch i ddim lot mwy dosbarth gweithiol yna. So mae hwnna'n rili galanogol bod diwylliant yn sôn am bethau dosbarth gweithiol, mae'n berthnasol i bobl dosbarth gweithiol. Dyw e ddim yn rhywbeth i'r dosbarth canol ragor. Yes, mae hwnna'n rili bwysig. A un beth arall ni mae'n sôn amdano o ran ymgyrchu a diwylliant yw mae canu'n Gymraeg wedi cael ei weld fel rhywbeth gwleidyddol. Fel mae bron bod yn safiad gwleidyddol i rywun siarad i ganu'n Gymraeg, sy'n mewn ffordd mae fe'n rhyfedd, achos mae fe'n rhywbeth gyda, mae rhai bandiau wedyn, erbyn hyn yn enwedig, mae'n gweud, ia, byddwn ni ddim yn canu'n Saesneg yn Gymraeg fi'n siarad, pan byddwn ni'n canu'n Saesneg. Ond oedd yna gyfnod pan oedd canu'n Gymraeg yn cael ei weld fel safiad gwleidyddol a safiad gwleidyddol pwysig. Ond un peth rili diddorol am superfeiriannol, pob un wedi clywed amdano nhw, canu'n Saesneg, a oedd y Cymdeithas yn beirniadu nhw, fi'n meddwl, am gyfnod. So wnaethon nhw sgwennu can, nid hon yw'r gan sy'n mynd i achub yr iaith. So jyst yn briliant, mae'n jyst yn dweud y cyfan. Fel, dyw'r ffaith bod ni'n canu'n Saesneg ddim yn mynd i achub yr iaith. Ddim yn mynd i, neu, ie, petai ni'n canu'n Gymraeg, bydde ddim yn achub y Gymraeg. Ond i raddau, galle fe, ond ie, so ie.
Sioned, mae'n ddod os chdi cyn ni mynd ymlaen i'r cwestiwn nesaf. Diolch, Bethan.
Ie, diolch. Pwyntio hynny ddiddorol gan Bethan fyna. Achos un peth sydd wastad yn taro ti yw bod yr iaith, bod yr acen Gymreig yn Saesneg ac yn Gymraeg yn adlewyrchu eich greiddiau daearyddol yn hytrach na eich greiddiau dosbarth. A yn hollol wahanol i Saesneg Lloegr enghraifft. Felly bod e'n hollol dderbyniol i siarad ac acen o'r cymoedd a bod ag unrhyw fath o swydd, ynddo fe? Felly, chymod, oeddech chi ddim, oedd ddim AP yng Nghymru. A jyst i ddweud hefyd, wrth gwrs, mae jyst y pethau i ni yn meddwl amdanyn nhw ac yn cymryd nhw'n ganiataol, mae rhaid i ni wastad herio nhw. Dwi'n dod o gartre di-Gymraeg, a pan dwi'n dweud hwnna wrth bobl, maen nhw jyst yn synnu'n lan, achos Sioned yw'n enw i. Fe enw i yw Sioned, achos ath mam yn ferch o Rymni ger Merthyr i goleg normal, a cael Ambrose Bebb yn ddarlithydd iddi hi, ac enw i merch ei ferch oedd Sioned, ac oedd mam erioed wedi clywed yr enw o'r blaen. Felly dyna sut ges i'r enw Sioned. A fe ges i'r iaith Gymraeg oherwydd addysg Gymraeg mwy na heb, yn amlwg oedd e nôl yng nghenedlaeth mam gi, ond oedd e ddim yn iaith yr aelwyd. Felly, chmod, mae'r mynediad yna, a dyna beth sydd wedi newid hefyd yn dyfe. Nath yn rhieni i yn cael ei magu mewn, oedd Cymraeg yn y capel, ond Saesneg oedd yr iaith adre, Saesneg oedd iaith y stryd, Saesneg oedd iaith addysg, Saesneg oedd iaith y cyfryngau torfol, doedd na ddim byd Cymraeg iddyn nhw ar wahân i'r diwylliant crefyddol yn yr ardal yna o ddeddwyrian Cymru. Erbyn hyn, dwi'n meddwl bod na fynediad at addysg Gymraeg i bawb. Yn amlwg gallai fe wella, ni gyd yn gwybod hynny. Ond hefyd mae yna gyfle i ddysgu'r iaith mewn ffordd oedd e ddim arfer bod. A mae modd medru mynd i glywed cerddoriaeth Cymraeg i weld, cynrychiadau Cymraeg i glywed clywed Cymraeg ar radio, ar teledu ac yn y blaen ac ar ein cyfrifiaduron. Felly, chymod, mae'r mynediad yna yn wneud gwahaniaeth. A dyna be dwi'n meddwl hefyd ers dyddiau Dragon Has Two Tongues hefyd, mae pethau wedi symud mlaen oherwydd gwleidyddiaeth. Oherwydd nawr bod yn enwedig yn sgil yr ymgyrchoedd ni'n gwybod amdanyn nhw drwy Gymdeithas yr Iaith a hefyd Plaid Cymru, a oherwydd datganoli mae fe wedi dod yn rhywbeth, mae'r dwyieithrwydd yna nawr yn rhywbeth sydd ddim yn gorfod herio i gilydd a bod y Gymraeg i bawb. Wy'n derbyn yn sicr, dwi ddim yn naif, wy'n gwybod bod llai o fynediad gan bobl sydd heb dderbyn addysg Gymraeg neu ddim wedi cael y cyfle i ddysgu Cymraeg at y pethau hynny, ond dyw hynny ddim i ddweud, y frwydr wedyn yw wneud yn siŵr bod gan bawb fynediad cyfartal at y pethau hynny, mwyn bod pawb yn teimlo bod nhw'n gallu cyfrannu a cyfranogi i'r diwylliant yn yr un modd ac hynny'n gydradd, ynddo fe?
Ac yn sydyn iawn, Sioned, na i just gofyn i chdi os wedi gadael ateb yn sydyn, ond mae gen i fi ddiddordeb yn yr ateb, so dwi am ofyn o anyway. Be wyt ti'n meddwl o'r hyn oedd Rory yn sôn amdan yr iaith na a'r mynediad i'r iaith na yn cael ei ddefnyddio mwyn ddefnyddio y diwylliant Cymreig mwyn galluogi bobl i gael edrychiad o fod yn radical, i gael edrychiad o fod yn deg. Ti'n meddwl bod hynna'n rhywbeth sydd yn digwydd yma yng Nghymru fel oedd Rory yn siarad amdan yn yr Alban efo'r Scots, a ydy'r gwahaniaethau yn y ddwy iaith yn ddigonol i sicrhau bod hynny mae'n gallu digwydd yn yr un ffordd?
Wel, wi sicr yn meddwl bod yr iaith a'r gwahaniaeth yn cael ei defnyddio gan wahanol garfannau i ddibenion ideolegol. Ond be dwi'n meddwl yw yr her yw wastad i herio hynny, achos fel ni'n gweud, yr amrywiaeth yw'r allwedd fan hyn, dwi'n meddwl. Dwi'n meddwl bod pobl yn gweld trwy y pethau hynny yn aml iawn. Authenticity is all mewn gwleidyddiaeth, a mae pobl yn ddigon safi i weld pan nad hynny yw'r achos. Felly dwi'n gallu adnabod beth mae fe'n gweud o fewn ein diwylliant ni yma yng Nghymru yn sicr. A mae yna sicr rhwystrau yn cael ei roi yn ffordd rhai pobl sydd falle yn cael eu clusnodi i berthyn i un garfan neu'r llall, fel bod nhw ddim yn gallu croesi mewn mewn i'r garfan arall. Felly dwi'n adnabod yr hyn mae fe'n dweud, ond dwi ddim yn llwyr derbyn bod yn rhywbeth dyw pobl ddim yn gallu gweld trwyddo a herio.
Diolch, Sioned, ie. Rory and Harriet, you've both got your hands up, but in the same way that I mentioned to Sioned now, I am aware that we need to move on to the second question. So I'm just going to ask Rory, would you like to come in? But if you could keep it a little bit brief, that would be lovely. Thank you. Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute.
I'll happily move it on to the second question. If
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Yeah, fine. And Harriet, you're happy? Yeah. Okay. So our second question is, and dwi'n mynd i ddweud yn Gymraeg, yn ail gwestiwn ni ydy, sut mae datganoli gwleidyddol wedi effeithio ar fywyd diwylliannol a sifil, a yw'r pethau hyn yn dal yn ddigon radical ac annibynnol ar y llywodraeth nawr bod y llywodraeth yn fwy cenedlaethol. So mae hwnna yn gwestiwn sydd yn dilyn ymlaen yn reit ar hyn da ni wedi bod yn trafod, a be ydy effeithiau a'r bron iawn proffesiynoli yn gwleidyddiaeth ni yn y ddwy wlad ar hyn da ni wedi bod yn trafod yn barod. Rory, I'm going to come to you first because you wanted to speak last time, so I'll come to you first with this question, if that's okay.
Do you mind if I come in on that?
Yeah,
great.
Go for it.
I think the point about professionalization is especially important. One of the big process, like historical processes I'm really interested in is NGOization. That is to say that the transformation of kind of really living and fluid social movements that can be quite chaotic, often, quite anarchic and DIY and messy, under various pressures, start to professionalize, usually out of some degree of success, but also defensiveness, start to professionalize and form into NGOs and lobby groups and things like that. And there's important things about this process that I think are really relevant to nationalism and constitutional campaigning. And I think you'll be aware of in Wales as well as in Scotland, which is that as part of that, you get a kind of grassroots movement that starts to turn away from, facing in towards communities, stops facing towards communities, stops facing towards ordinary people's concerns, not just in terms of hearing their concerns, but organizing and empowering people to prosecute their concerns. And they turn towards influencing government. And they become a kind of arm of the state. In some cases, they provide services. In some cases, they provide the kind of government service of being a useful voice for certain communities in consultations and things like that. They're the people that, if government wants to solve poverty, they don't go into an impoverished community, they go and speak to like the NGO that does poverty, And usually the people that run these NGOs are actually middle class and often, don't actually live in these communities and things like this. So I think this is interesting when it comes to the national question, because one of the ways that I see devolution is the kind of NGOization of the nation. A devolved government is not a state. It's really important to make that distinction. A devolved, our devolved government in Scotland wants people to think it's a state until it has to take responsibility for something it doesn't like, at which point it goes, Westminster did that, take it up with them. But even more importantly, one of the ways that the Scottish government gets its legitimacy is it postures as like a lobby group for the Scottish people vis-a-vis Westminster. So it performs the same kind of function as an NGO in that way, except it's an NGO for the Scottish public in general. It like lobbies for us on the world stage, but the government itself can't actually do very much. And this is the real danger with devolution, because not only does it claim a huge amount of democratic legitimacy to itself, of representative legitimacy, but it also strips that legitimacy of any power to do much. It certainly claims it can't do much. And so you end up with this real like lobster pot situation where all of the people's demands and desires go into this seemingly representative organization, and then they get stuck there. And I think that's my big issue with devolution, is that it's got this huge, people talk about the democratic deficit. They don't talk about the democratic surplus, which is that these institutions have too much consent. They're in this like really privileged position where they don't have to be accountable for the really difficult choices about, trade union legislation and tax rises and things that are reserved, but they do get all the support that you get as the kind of, we speak on behalf of your community. And so I think, and you see this replicated all the way through Scottish life. I mean, the Scottish Parliament is this huge magnet for NGOization because it is accessible. And so you get social movements going, actually, it's quite easy to lobby these politicians. So we'll just form an NGO and speak to them. Rather than really empowering communities to take their own kind of power, it goes, oh, but we can actually quite easily represent these communities to the devolved parliament, and then they'll deal with the lobbying Westminster on our behalf. And again, it sucks all this power in and then doesn't do much with it. So I hate devolution. I can't stand it. I think we should get rid of it one way or another, frankly. Yeah, that's the basic framing that I have for this question. Is it's a
so
kind
can I ask you then, Rory, if you see it in that way, what's your approach to creating a voice that's identifiable to Scotland, that addresses Scotland's needs? What's your how do you go about creating that voice within the structures that we have available to us without being sucked in and co-opted into those structures at the same time?
I mean, I think it's really difficult. Obviously, independence is one way of doing that. It's the next step after devolution. Once you've gone down this road, I mean, I'm not really arguing that we should abolish the Scottish Parliament and go back to Westminster. That would be worse. But I do think that something interesting happened before the Scottish Parliament existed, which that you had this huge explosion of Scottish political and cultural self-expression without a parliament. We didn't need a parliament to do that. But people think that it just kind of came out of nowhere. It didn't. It came out of the welfare state. It came because people had the resources and the security to express themselves in public. that a huge number of working class people had kind of access to the things they needed, a decent amount of the things they needed for the first time in history, and had the security to engage in the public sphere fully, in a way that hadn't been so easy beforehand. And so that created this huge flowering of left-wing culture in Scotland that was nationalist. And so I guess, and I think the Scottish Parliament has kind of dragged a lot of the energy out of that. So is austerity and neoliberalism. But I don't necessarily think independence would bring it back, because what you really need for that kind of independent and critical culture is resources. You need money and you need to redistribute wealth and power. And I think regardless of whether or not we have independence or not, if we don't have an economic structure that redistributes some wealth to the people who create the best kind of culture in our society, then it's not going to create a more vibrant and independent culture. So I think it's much more important to focus on the kinds of changes that would redistribute wealth than simply focusing on constitutional change.
It's really interesting what you were saying there about the welfare state leading to that explosion, and the reflections that I see there in what Bethan said as well, and regarding the people who were campaigning with Cymdeithas yr Iaith being students and having access to that education, and that being the thing that allowed them to express themselves, to being in that space where they had that capacity to move forward. It's really interesting to see those reflections in both cultures there. Katie?
Just building on what Rory was saying, which I wholeheartedly agree with. I think that people often get put into a position where, at the end of the day, you do have in Holyrood a government who's slightly better than the government, or better than slightly better, you decide the degree, than Westminster. And so I think that just by being slightly better than, that makes them, in this, that mechanism that Rory is describing. And I think that the cultural output sort of reflects that it becomes difficult to solely challenge Holyrood when you've got like a bigger beast down south. And I think that that's one of the issues, right? Is that like Holyrood needs more scrutiny, and this sort of fairly, and I think it's because people see it as less potent as a centre of power. And it is, in comparison to Westminster, it is a bit more provincial, because you don't have the same sort of arteries of financial globalisation in Scotland as you do. So there are differences that should be recognised, but there is also a small pool of elites who like Rory was describing, some of whom who have been co-opted, but some of whom dominate the policy making landscape, and that's reflected too in the sort of cultural output. The sort of cultural arm of the Yes movement, National Collective, which Rory can speak to a lot more than I can, because I wasn't really involved in it. But that was an example of lots of those people ended up working for the Scottish government and the SNP. These people who were the activists then went on the inside. So that utopian moment, that moment of like excitement and flourishing of hope, of imagining a different place, got sucked into the machine. And I don't want to use like cliches, but that's kind of what happened. And this, at the same time, you have, as part of devolution, arts are actually not, comparatively compared to other countries, not bad resourced, but there is like a new professionalization of the arts, and it's this universal challenge. When you start having state-funded arts, does that make it very difficult to have radical or avant-garde sort of works that can really challenge the state? And I think, that is maybe in some ways reflected in what's happened to Gaelic. Gaelic's been mentioned a wee bit in the chat, and we've spoken about Welsh and Scots, but not so much about Gaelic, which, there's a bit of a movement to gentrify this language, to sort of use a blunt metaphor, where it's seen as like the hobby of sort of fairly wealthy families who want their kids to go to the Gaelic school because it's got the best rates. Meanwhile, Gaelic communities who live in the Western Isles can't afford to buy houses and can't afford to keep their culture going, can't afford to, those communities don't exist anymore, they're being gutted. And so you also have, even intrinsic to the way that Gaelic is funded and resourced and managed as this sort of identity marker of difference, well, those communities are degrading.
Yeah, that picture that you create of what you call the gentrification of Gaelic is something that we often we often possibly see reflected in Welsh culture and the, Welsh education. Yes, we want Welsh education for all, but how much is that same pattern being followed here, where, we have communities in the west of Wales and in the, what people call the strong Welsh language areas of Wales that are being gutted, can't afford to buy homes, can't afford to keep their culture going, where in other areas of Wales, parents are keen for their kids to get that Welsh education because those schools have got the best rates, and how do those relationships work together and benefit each other. Gai ofyn wan wrth ni symud ymlaen felly, ac cyn i fi ddod i Harriet, Sioned a Bethan, y cwestiwn sy'n codi o hyn felly ydy, i bwy ma diwylliant Cymru ac i bwy ma diwylliant Alban? So who is the culture, who is it for? The culture of Wales, the culture of Scotland, whose is it? Who is allowed to enjoy it and that kind of thing? Harriet, I'll come to you first.
I was excited to chip in on the last one, but okay.
You can jump through both if you like, yeah. That's not a problem.
I was just going to have a go at Labour Party centrists, Welsh Labour Party centrists. I'm so getting kicked out of the Labour Party, but whatever, this is my analysis, right? That like the worst, I think how I shape my political analysis is that I look what centrists in the Labour Party say and then think the opposite of them. And in this instance, the centrists will not argue against devolution. It's like an accepted fact, which I think is really telling and really interesting. And then the radical thing has been to call for independence. And I think this is like a really interesting ground that's being shaped. Now, I say that cautiously because obviously not everyone in the independence movement is radical, but in those terms, within, I imagine, like Senedd circles, sorry, Sioned, I imagine that is the kind of distinction that's playing out. And I find it absolutely fascinating to see how Welsh Labour back themselves into a corner by saying, we're better off in the union, or by the way, we can't implement what we want to implement because we've just had this budget from Westminster. Which one is it? I often think to myself, who is the obstacle to socialism in Wales? Is it Boris Johnson or is it Mark Drakeford? Because if Mark Drakeford says it's Westminster and yet says stay in the union, right, that's me out of the Labour Party. Let's move on to culture. I guess it depends what we mean. And I find it really interesting who is funded and who isn't funded, right? So, for example, my brother is a musician from Merthyr Tydfil, he's really, really talented. We had a conversation the other day about like meritocracy. He was arguing that, oh, you can do anything, blah, blah, blah. And I think the conversation was interesting in terms of like, would he get funding for a project in Wales? And I don't think he would. And I think there's key areas why he wouldn't. And I think this all played out in that discussion over the Merthyr Rising. I don't know if you guys saw that on Twitter. There was this huge discussion about Edith Crawford not being asked to perform at the festival. And I'm not going to go into that too much, but I thought it was really, really fascinating as it showed the difference in cultural expectations. It's the same with Welsh language bands. They're not really asked to play the festival either. And the festival seems to focus on like English speaking bands of the late 80s and 90s. Now, this isn't my taste, but I think it's really interesting. Their argument was, Merthyr Rising's argument was that people in Merthyr just want to listen to this type of music. And it was fascinating. It was like, is there really a constituency of people that just hate hip hop? Is that a real proposition? Or is that assumed from that cultural norm of the town? And this comes back into the argument about my brother, about who gets funding there and who doesn't, who gets a platform there, who doesn't. I've waffled a little bit now because I threw myself out of the Labour Party, sorry.
Sioned, gai ddod ata chdi nesa?
Ie, hynod o ddiddorol, a dwi'n cytuno i raddau ynglyn â'r NGOism, ond wrth gwrs ni wedi cael syched mor hir am sefydliadau a ffram genedlaethol yng Nghymru, bod ni, fyddwn ni'n dweud i gyd yn mwynhau yr eiliad yma ar hyn o bryd. I chi yn yr Alban wedi cael canrifoedd ar ein blaen ni yn hyn o beth, wedi mwynhau canrifoedd ar y blaen ni o ran hyn o beth, o ran y bywyd civic yna. Felly mae fe'n rhywbeth hollol newydd sbon i fod yn amlwg oedd na bethau yn bodoli. ers dyddiau Cymru fydd, ond mae yna sychder mawr wedi bod am y bywyd yma, a dwi'n meddwl bod medru troi at bobl sy'n arbenigwyr ar Gymru, yn hytrach na bod ni'n troi nodyn bach mewn adroddiad, neu jyst yn cael ein anwybyddu yn llwyr gan ymchwil, bod hynny yn rhywbeth sy'n hynod fanteisiol i ni, llunwyr polisi, ond hefyd i ni o ran, fel o'n i'n sôn, meithrin yr hunaniaeth cenedlaethol yna, a rhoi lleisiau i'n cymunedau ni. Felly, dyna'n safbwynt i ar hynny. Jyst eisiau gweud rhywbeth yn sydyn iawn, falle mwy penodol o ran yr enghraifft o sut mae datganoli yn benodol wedi effeithio ar fywyd civic a diwylliannol, achos mae'r dramodydd Ian Rowlands wedi sôn tipyn am hyn, wedi datganoli, oedd dim angen i artistiaid cadw i sôn am y genedl drwy'r amser, fel oedden nhw falle wedi gorfod yn enwedig yn y 60au a'r 70au, a Bethan yn sôn am y canu gwleidyddol yna, ond achos mae'r genedl yna, fel dwi wedi sôn, heb ffram wleidyddol gyda fawr, yn dibynnu ar gelf i gynnal y genedl, i gynnal yr hunaniaeth, ond wedyn unwaith bod y ffram wleidyddol yna wedi cael ei chreu, mae grymoedd a ffactorau eraill yn gallu dod i'r amlwg, ac o'n i jyst yn meddwl am beth mae Ian wedi sôn amdano fe, enghraifft dywyll yna, ond hynod arwyddocaol yna, yw ei ddrama fe Blink, sef y ddrama ynghylch y camdrin buodd ar blant yn ysgol gyfun Gymraeg Prydfelen, gan rhywun wrth gwrs oedd yn eitha yn rhan o'r sefydliad, yn arwr, yn genedlaetholwr, John Owens, yn dyfe, John Owen. Ac awgrym Rowlands mewn ffordd yw mae datganoli, greuodd y cyd-destun i'r oedolion yna, yr actorion yna, i roi dystiolaeth a cael yr hyder i wneud hynny, i ganiatáu i ymchwiliad clywch ddigwydd, arweiniodd wrth gwrs at greu Comisiynydd Plant Cymru, a bod Cymru'n arwain y ffordd mewn hawliau plant, felly drwy newid y ffram, drwy newid y cyd-destun gwleidyddol yna, fe ryddhad grymoedd diwylliannol a gwleidyddol oedd wedi cael ei hatal, ei represio dros y canrifoedd. Felly, o'n i jyst eisiau rhoi yr enghraifft ymarferol yna.
Mae hwnna'n enghraifft rili pwysig, rwy'n teimlo. Bethan, gael i chdi ddod i mewn?
Fi'n mynd i wneud yn ofyd i'r gwestiwn cynt, sori. Mae gadw fe'n fyr. Ond o ran diwylliant ymgyrchu, mae datganoli wedi newid fel popeth. Mae wedi newid yn llwyr. A fi'n dod o gyfnod, dechreuais i ymgyrchu ar ôl datganoli. O'n i ddim yn ymwybodol o ymgyrchu yn ystod cyfnod San Steffan heb gynulliad. Gynulliad oedd ei ddechrau, wrth gwrs. Nes, ymgyrch Ysbryd oedd Ysbryd am fygythiad yn amlwg DCMS yn Lloegr, oedd yn gyfrifol am hwnna. A oedd yr ymgyrchu gyd yn digwydd yng Nghymru, neu yn benna yng Nghymru, ond oedd y grymoedd i gyd draw fyna. A fi ddim yn sôn yn daearyddol o'n y draw fyna, oedd na weinidogion oedd yn gweud, Ysbryd. Ddim di, ond clywed amdano fe, Ysbryd, beth yw e? Nhw oedd yn gyfrifol am Ysbryd. O'n nhw'n gwylio fewn, ddim yn gwybod beth oedd e. So, o'n nhw'n bell yn ddiwylliannol a yn ddaearyddol. A mae'r ffaith bod Sioned gyda ni nawr, mae fe yn wneud ymgyrchu yn rhwyddach. Mae fe'n lot yn fwy accessible. So, un beth arall hefyd o ran na, yw mae yna lot o grwpiau cymunedol a'r faterion penodol yn teimlo bod nhw'n gallu ymgyrchu, a yn aml, falle ar lefel sirol mae fe'n erbyn i cyngor sir, ond mae yna deimlad fel, o'n i'n sylwi mae Cara Steve ma'n rhywle, maen nhw wedi sefydlu siarter cartrefi, mae hwnna'n rhywbeth cymunedol. Dyw e ddim yn, so mae yna ddiwylliant o NGOs a pobl rili proffesiynol, ond wedyn mae yna fudiadau cymunedol hefyd sy'n rili llawr gwlad, a maen nhw ar yr un lefel mewn ffordd, a NGOs. Fi'n meddwl bod Cymdeithas wedi cyrraedd y lefel yna, ble i ni yn amlwg ar y tu fas, ni byth yn mynd i fod ar y tu fewn, a'n cytuno gyda popeth, ond os yw'r llywodraeth yn mynd i ymgynghori, ni'n un o'r bobl maen nhw'n mynd i ymgynghori gyda nhw. Ddim yn gwrando arno ni, Ond trwy bod syniad yn hunain gyda ni, mae'n neud lot o noddech iddyn nhw anwybyddu ni, a hwnna yw'r peth i'n meddwl. Na nhw ddim gwrando arno ni, ond gallwch chi ddim anwybyddu ni mor rhwydd. A wedyn so o ran diwylliant wedyn, sort of yr ail gwestiwn, un peth nath daro fi, a suppose falle bod hwn o brofiad Cymraeg yn hytrach na Cymreig, mae dyn ni ddiwylliant yn creu pethau'n hunain. Enghraifft eitha diweddar, Radio Beca, just pobl i bob pwrpas sefydlu gorsaf radio newydd, gymunedol, lleol, achos oedd mae angen am un. Does da un sianel radio sydd gyda ni, really. Mae gyda ni Radio Cymru 2 sydd ddim really yn sianel ar wahân, ond achos bod angen, a mwyn democrateiddio'r holl beth, nath criw o bobl sefydlu sianel radio ar gyfnod pan oedd podcasto yn dechrau dod yn boblogaidd. Mae hwnna jyst yn, hollol DIY, a mae yna bethau fel tŷ chwith a stamp sy'n newydd ar ei ben. Mae nhw'n bethau, falle mae nhw'n cael rhyw fedar i'n llywodraeth, ond dyn nhw ddim yn ddibynnol ar y grant, so mae nhw'n gallu gwneud pethau bach mwy, I suppose, out there. A un o'r pethau, actually, rili diddorol, nath ddigwydd gyda Radio Beca, nath groesi'r ffiniau o fod yn rhywbeth diwylliannol radio. So yn dilyn, nath cael sefydlu, ddim spel cyn Brexit, digwydd bod, a nath nhw benderfynu cynnal gweithdy a trafod, a pobl cefn gwlad yma yn benna, ond oedden nhw'n wneud y diwylliant rhywfaint. A jyst cael sgwrs yma am Brexit, a bwriad oedd wneud rhywbeth diwylliannol, ond beth oedd mas o hwnna yn y pen draw oedd i llyfr nhw datgoloneiddio, a fel datgoloneiddio'ch eich hunain, a fi yna mynd rownd yn wneud fel sgyrsiau sut i fel peidio bod yn colonised mewn ffordd, a oedd hwnna jyst yn, so oedd hwnna'n diwylliant yn croesi mewn i'r gwleidyddol hollol naturiol, pobl cefn gwlad fydde ddim yn ystyried eu hunain, bobl gwleidyddol fydde'n gallu gwneud y peth yma, so hwnna'n enghraifft perffaith.
Mae'n bod yn enghraifft o herwydd lle mae Cymru ar yn taith i gymharu efo'r Alban, bod o'n enghraifft o sut fod diwylliant Cymreig yn gallu ymateb i anghenion gwleidyddol pobloedd ac yn gallu ymateb i wahaniaethau yn diwylliannau Cymreig, oherwydd mae'n lot o ffyrdd gwahanol o fod yn Gymraeg yn does, yn dal yn gallu ymateb i hynna heb bod nhw yn gorfod mynd trwy yr ffynhonnellau ariannu arfennol, a felly gwarchod y radicaliaeth yna o fewn y diwylliant yn dal. Ac ydyn ni felly mewn sefyllfa lle ydyn ni bron iawn o'i golli fo, neu ydyn ni'n gallu gafel ymlaen i'r radicaliaeth na gafel ymlaen i'r syniad na o greu ymatebion yn hunan, tra yn dal yn parhau i fynd ar yr un un llwybr ar Alban a mynd yn agosach at annibyniaeth. Mae'n syniad rili diddorol i feddwl amdan dydy. Rory, can I come to you?
So I don't mind if you want to move on to the next one.
I'll come to you quickly, Rory, so you can come back, and then we'll move on to questions from the floor if that's possible, because we're running a little bit late. So, but the conversation is so interesting, I don't want to cut it too short.
I guess one of the thing, I think it was the point I was thinking of was something Sioned had said, which is that devolution has allowed artists to do something other than represent the nation finally. That now the Parliament has taken up the burden of representation, writers can do something else. This is, I mean, identical, amazingly similar to the exact arguments people were making in the 70s and 80s in Scotland from the perspective of what will devolution mean for our intellectuals? And they were going, it will free us from the terrible burden of nationhood, and we'll be able to do some really critical avant-garde stuff. Now, one of the things that I was trying to say earlier is that I actually think the reason that people weren't able to do critical avant-garde stuff was resources and security. It wasn't that they had this burden of nationhood. And actually you see through the 80s, people like Alistair Gray, James Kelman, Tom Leonard, again, you should read Scott's book. They're able to do amazingly critical and avant-garde stuff about the nation. And one of the reasons they're able to do this is because they didn't have to faithfully represent anybody, because the Scottish nation is not itself particularly radical or critical or avant-garde. It's just a kind of another Western European capitalist democracy. These things are quite boring. And one of the advantages, I think, in a paradoxical way of not having a parliament is that other people could represent the nation that didn't have to be elected to do so. The ways in which you represented the nation could be creative and push boundaries and things. And frankly, if you're an elected political leader, it's significantly harder to do that when you have to be accountable to like an aggregated mass of the population. So I think there's two sides to this, which is that actually it wasn't such a burden when people other than elected politicians got to represent the nation, because it meant that if you're a trade union, you can just say, we speak for Scotland. You don't have to be elected to do it. You can just say it. If you're the left, you can come along and go, this is what Scottishness is. And there doesn't have to be any like proof anywhere down the line. So you can claim that Scotland is a radical and socialist country. And people go, oh yeah, interesting point. Maybe I should, if I really want to be Scottish, I should vote for a socialist party, or I should be more socialist, be more Scottish. Whereas if you're Nicola Sturgeon, you've got to tell everyone that Scottishness is kind of this inoffensive, all things to all people kind of thing. And so if politics is representing us, if politics is doing the work that culture really should be doing, it also leads to a kind of flattening of nationhood, this like hollowing out of the country and what it could potentially mean, because people can only reflect it back to itself. So I think there's a real danger in allowing devolution to take up the work of representation, when actually it should be the goal of the left to speak for the country as it could be, rather than the country as it is.
Well, that's a really interesting point to bring into it. I'm wondering, you were speaking about saying that they represent, who do they represent, and they don't represent anything specifically. And I'm wondering, when you compare that to Wales, how does the language then fit into that? Because, when creative people were representing nation and stuff, they were in fact carrying the language with them, and that's adding a different flavour to actually what they were preserving. And Sioned, ti eisiau dod I mewn adio hynna allan? I don't know if that makes a difference to the experience in Scotland and the experience in Wales.
Ti eisiau gadael I Rory ddod nôl ar hwnna wedyn? O'n I eisiau mateb yw bwynt gwreiddiol ond gadael I Rory ddod nôl I ateb hynny.
Dwi wedi cymlethu'r sefyllfa wan yn meddwl yn hyn. Yeah, Rory, do you want to come back on that point? I've complicated the situation thinking aloud, actually. So, yeah, of course.
I'm conscious that we're running out of time for audience questions. So could we kind of open it up? Is that possible?
Yeah, if Sioned can come in and then Harriet quickly, and then I will open it up. Yes, we've got until 7:30, so I was hoping to leave it until 7:15 so that we could finish having the conversation and then open it up to questions. Yes. Yeah,
o'n I ddim eisiau mateb i'r pwynt diwethaf, o'n I jyst eisiau dod nôl ar beth oedd Rory'n gweud tra'n cydnabod yn amlwg, a dwi di sgwennu fy hunan am y peryglon o organoli, o greu y diwylliannau sy'n perthyn I y sefydliadau sydd yng Nghaerdydd a sydd dan nawdd y Llywodraeth, a dwi'n meddwl bod ein cyrff comisiynu a'n cyrff dyrannu grantiau, ein cyrff sydd fod I feithrin diwylliant. Mae o wastad yn berygl yn diwe, fel dwi'n meddwl oedd Katie wedi sôn, bod hynny'n gallu mygu rhywbeth. Ond byddwn I ddim yn derbyn chwaith, beth o'n i'n trio dweud, bod e'n gallu agor, nid bod datganoli wedi arwain wedyn, bod e'n fwrn, nid bod creu y genedl yn fwrn ar yr awduron oedd yn ysgrifennu ac yn gweithio neu'r artistiaid oedd yn creu cyn datganoli. Ond hynny yw, dyna oedd ei testyn nhw, achos dyna oedd nhw'n dychmygu. A mi oedd peidio gorfod adlewyrchu ar hynny o hyd yn ymryddhau wedyn rhywbeth arall, ond beth o'n i'n trio dangos drwy'r enghraifft nes I sôn amdano fe oedd yr ymgrymuso yna yn gallu digwydd mewn ffordd lle doedden ni ddim jyst yn siarad am greu strwythur wleidyddol. A felly dyna beth o'n i'n trio gweud, mae'n am fwy nag un ffordd y mae datganoli yn gallu cael effaith a ymgrymuso diwylliant. Nid yn unig, nid bod o reidrwydd yn gorfod bod y peth eich testyn hynny yw. Mae'n gallu bod yn rhywbeth mwy anuniongyrchol na hynny, felly jyst eisiau gwneud hynny.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Sioned. Oce, os gown ni agor allan i'r llawr rwan felly, ag dod y pawb mewn. Os oes gennych chi gwestiynau, os fedrwch chi roed eich llaw i fyny, a na i geisio dod atoch chi gyd mewn ordor. Os ydw i yn gallu gweld llaw i fyny drwy'r function ar Zoom, dyna fysa'r ffordd orau. Felly mae'n posib i chi fynd ar y gwylod a clicio reactions a roed eich llaw i fyny, raise hand. So, nawn ni ddod i Daniel gynta, Daniel Richards.
Hi. Yeah. It's basically regarding where we are exactly with Welsh independence. I think the comments we've made that there is a big danger in conflating Welsh and Scottish independence movement. There was a very good article today in the National, and I think in the Scottish National, by Reuben Duffy regarding the differences between Scottish independence movement and the reunification of Ireland, and the dangers of drawing parallels between the two. When we come to Welsh independence, as much as I myself would really want this to happen sooner rather than later, aren't we in danger of overcooking the goose in saying that there is a radical spirit and a drive towards independence rather than just a reaction to the growth of independence in Scotland? Is there not quite a lot of this has been a reaction to Scotland's decisions becoming more and more likely to the UK, and Welsh independence is a reaction of it, and a reaction to that, rather than being an independent movement in and of itself.
Harriet, would you like to come in on that question?
I think this is a really interesting point, and I put it in one of the speeches that I've written and then forgot to read it out. But I think we'd be in a danger of just simply comparing ourselves to Scotland, because I think we're in very different positions. I think we have the benefit in Wales of it not being solely, of learning from Scotland, right? And I think the areas where we can learn from are what I talked about earlier, the kind of utopics. So like my experience of the referendum was it was everything to everyone. And you could project onto the referendum whatever you wanted, which was great. It was thrilling. Like, I thought we were going to live in a communist utopia. Some people thought we were going to live in like SMP land forever. But I think the key thing here is that we need the kind of like utopic discussion in Wales, but also the discussion about how that's going to work and the vision for that, because that's where the Scottish referendum fell down, was a discussion around like currency, like all of the boring stuff that came in at the end, like we couldn't answer as the independence movement. I'm saying we, because we had to play catch up, whereas we focused on like the grand narrative, but not on that. And I don't want us to fall into the same trap in Wales. I think we need to provide a kind of utopian narrative for very specific things. As a way to move forward as a movement. I'm also conscious that the Welsh independence movement spends a lot of time reacting to Westminster rather than providing its own vision, which I think is the key obstacle here. If we continually react to the swear words in Westminster, then we're continually fighting on that terrain. We're not doing it independently of ourselves with our own vision. It's like continually in this dynamic, and the whole point is that we want to break that dynamic. Thanks.
Well, just to quickly come in on that, I mean, I suppose I suppose one of my main, almost harkening back to the 70s of wanting independence was almost to like, what would it be like to not have that relationship, that relational way? But I think it's impossible to get away from that, right? It's impossible to get away from the relationality of politics. So even if you do want to, you know, that it's always in contrast to something, right? That is the nature of different identities, of borders, of all these things, is that it's in contrast to something else. So I feel like trying to pretend that you could create like a crucible that is away from that maybe you're chasing an impossibility, and then maybe it's who are you talking about when you're talking about the people you don't want, you know, is it sort of financialized neoliberalism, is it Westminster? I don't know. It just feels like it's impossible to get away from the relationality and to get away from being able to, you know, identify commonalities with movements in other places, like Scotland often did with like Catalonia or other sort of like independence movements.
Interesting, yeah. Ina, would you like to come in? So chi'n licio dod I mewn?
Diolch. Trafodaeth reit difyr, diolch yn fawr I pawb. Cwestiwn dwi am gofyn y panel ydy hyn. Meddyliwch bod ni'n deng yn ymlaen. Be bysai'r diwylliant yn edrych I hi wedyn? Be bysai'n llwyddiannus? Pa ffordd bysa'ch chi'n newid y diwylliant os bysai'n deng yn ymlaen? Mae papur o flaen chi, mae fe pisio nhw papur blanc o flaen chi. So, sgwennwch nawr, please.
Os rwy'n eisiau dod I mewn gyntaf, does any of our panelists want to jump in first of all on this one? So 10 years time, what would our culture look like? Bethan?
Wel, un o'r prif bethau o ran diwylliant yw bod ar gael yn Gymraeg. Mae rhaid iddo fe fod yn Gymraeg, achos diwylliant yw'r ffordd mlaen. A un o'n galwadau ni yw am fenter digidol Gymraeg, achos I ni gyd yn byw yn bywyd cymaint yn fwy ar-lein, a mae eisiau bod y Gymraeg ddim yn cael ei gadael ar ôl, fel mae wedi wneud. I ni'n dal I fod â un sianel deledu, ni'n dal I fod â un sianel radio Gymraeg. Does dim papur newydd cenedlaethol gyda ni. Falle bod oes papur newydd fel papur go iawn wedi bod, ond dwi ddim yn rhy hwyr i'r byd digidol. Felly, fi'n meddwl hwnna falle fydde un o'r pethau pwysica yw bod y Gymraeg yn hwyledol yn cael ei defnyddio ar-lein, bod yna ddeunydd mas yna, bod pobl ifanc yn defnyddio fe, a bod yn iaith fyw ar-lein. Hwnna yw'r, fi'n meddwl.
Rory?
Sorry, was that me?
Yes, that's you. Sorry, Rory. Please.
My like 10-year vision would probably be that no one ever talks about Scotland anymore. That we're over it. That we've managed to successfully get over it, and we can move on to something else. Because I think it has become kind of interminable and exhausting since IndieRef. The kind of charade of politicizing nationhood, like it feels very stuck. It feels like it's not really generating very much new thinking or any kind of new thought about what Scottishness is, and it almost feels like we've really reached the end of the road with a lot of it. And so I think I would like us to be so independent that we don't even need to worry about being independent anymore. Someone in the comments saying be boringly a normal country, that is absolutely not what I want. I want to be the least normal country in the world. I would like us to be incredibly weird. I would like us to have this immense tapestry of strange localities who all have their own little quirks and like slightly cultish traditions and things, where you don't really need to go beyond like the next like 50 miles down the road to do some real like exotic tourism. And so, I mean, I would just really like Scotland to kind of collapse in on itself and become just this kind of melting pot of competing regional identities and things. And I think that'd be much more interesting than this constant need to force every other identity into this one big agreeable container that we can all get behind. So more conflict and less consensus would be my vision for the next 10 years.
Sioned?
Diolch. Dwi'n meddwl be hoffwn I weld yw model aml-ganolfan, lle rhai o'r enghreifftiau oedd Bethan yn siarad amdano fe, lle o ran Radio Beca, meddwl am theatr Felin Fach, sut mae bod ni'n ymgrymuso'n cymunedau ni i'r graddau, bod nhw yn medru creu yr hyn maen nhw angen ac ar hyder I wneud hynny, ar adnoddau I wneud hynny, yn sgil annibyniaeth. A dyna beth fyddwn ni'n hoffi gweld, dwi'n meddwl. A dwi'n meddwl hefyd, mae yn y cytundeb cydweithio, mae Plaid Cymru wedi sicrhau bod diwylliant yn rhywbeth dylwn ni gael rhyw fath o strategaeth ar ei chyfer bod e'n rhan ac yn yngweiad pob adran o lywodraeth ym mhob ffordd i ni'n meddwl am bolisi ac am wariant cyhoeddus. A dwi'n cytuno â hynny, dwi'n meddwl bod angen i ddiwylliant fod yn rhan o'n ecosystem cenedlaethol ni ym mhob ffordd bosib, achos dwi yn gweld y celfyddydau fel rhywbeth sy'n rhoi hyder ac yn ymgrymuso ac yn rhoi llais i'r rheini sydd heb lais. Felly dyna beth byddwn i'n hoffi gweld.
Diolch yn fawr iawn. Jack, sgen ti gwestiwn?
Diolch, a diolch i bawb am sgwrs diddorol. I'll ask my question in English anyway. So just a focus one, I call a focus one, I guess, which I guess hasn't been brought up yet, but thinking about potential successes that we've seen in Wales, sort of building a sort of progressive cultural identity, I guess, has been through the Welsh football team, particularly recently. And certainly in terms of building a bilingual sort of progressive identity, we're trying to be often gesture that in here. Apologies for this being a bit Welsh-centric. I guess I'm just really for a quick one, what people think maybe some of the lessons are from the recent sort of identity that's been built around the Welsh football team, and maybe what that says going forward about building that cross sort of Welsh-speaking and non-Welsh-speaking or bilingual culture. So, yeah.
That's a really interesting question, because I think it's a really good example of something that feels really successful, and why is it successful, isn't it? So, pwy fysa'n licio dod I mewn ar hwnna gynta? So to our Scottish friends, and I'm far from an expert on this, you might know more about it than me, but the Welsh football team have successfully created this identity and this idea of who they are that brings the Welsh language, brings Welsh culture together in a way where that conflict doesn't exist. So it's almost a non-issue in a positive empowering way. So it's not a non-issue because we ignore it, it's a non-issue because we celebrate it. And that idea of sharing a platform, of becoming one team, is something that's really celebrated, and it's been really successful. I'm wondering whether there are examples like that in Scotland, Casey, that you can think of maybe, or where, or Rory, where there have been examples of something or an organisation or a group that's created that Scottish identity that's been able to bring the people of Scotland together in a really positive way.
Just to quickly jump in on that, and I know that Harriet had her hand up first, but I'm just thinking about at the weekend there was the anniversary of the Kenmure Street blockade of the immigration vans, and there was a wee festival in that neighbourhood in Glasgow, and but it's all, in some ways, that could have happened anywhere. It took some pot like nice just the coincidence of someone retweeting it on Twitter and it blowing up, and suddenly people are out on the streets. And that's not to take away from, I know that part of Glasgow, and there is like a political culture, there's an activism culture there that you learn just by being a resident in those streets. But walking around the festival over the weekend and seeing this, maybe, and kind of speaking to Rory's point about conflicting regionalisms within Scotland, but just like this pride in this neighbourhood, in this is who we are, and it isn't, and this is the most diverse neighbourhood in Scotland, or one of the most diverse neighbourhoods in Scotland. So you have people from every corner of the world in this neighbourhood, and there was like bands playing, there were street stalls, there was one of the fellas who was safe from the Home Office was giving out free cups of tea. It was just glorious, and I feel like that is where, at that level, is where people feel that connection, and I think is the most radical potential, has the most emancipatory potential, has the most potential to improve people's life and make them feel connected. So I feel like that was, I would love to hear about related moments in other places, but I feel like that's maybe the thing that I felt most inspired by in the last year in Scottish politics. And in some ways, there's also the bandwagon of jumping on that for people who who want to, but you know, there's a formation there of something, of an identifying with those people who were in the streets, that I think is really positive.
Harriet.
To answer Jack's question, I'm going to be really basic, right? And I think it's because it's cool, like genuinely. Like I now know all of the words to Ymgyrchwyr Hyd because I watched that like game where he was sitting and then he was crying. I loved it. And like I nearly went out and bought one of the football shirts. I don't even like football, but I was like, this is cool. And I think that's what's kind of like brought people together. And I think also since the rise of the Welsh independence movement, I think, yeah, the post-Corbyn kind of left has been kind of absorbed into that as well. So I think there is a certain amount of like, as I was saying earlier, resistance to Westminster and like the football. Like I think these two things have kind of merged like this. Like friends of mine who would have been Corbynites, etc., being like really proud of that game. Am I making sense? I just think it's cool. Like I'm basic and like I just wanted to go to that game and buy the shirt because I thought it was cool.
Rory.
I suppose it's so, I mean, it's one of the interesting things about this event is that it feels like Scotland and Wales are at very different like points in their like nationalist or like constitutional trajectory in like the relationship between politics and culture. Partly because there was definitely a point in the 80s and 90s when there was something like intrinsically cool about being Scottish, which is very connected to like cool Britannia. It was like a kind of tartan wing of cool Britannia, but it was where, you know, it was kind of a, yeah, cool Cymru as well. Yeah, it was like that. And it was political, definitely, and it was about defiance against Thatcherism. And that invested Scottishness with a kind of rebel energy. But again, I would warn against the consequences of that, because Katie's laughing at me because she knows how much of a killjoy I am, but nations just can't be depoliticized in this way. Like, you're always giving legitimacy to whoever ends up representing the nation, and it's always the ruling class at the end of the day. Like, so I would just be very wary of like allowing nationhood to become too cool. This is why I think our national anthem and our icons and things should be quite cringe, because you can't allow people to get too comfortable with like their national iconography, because this stuff ultimately is in the hands of the people who are already in power. And whether they're in Wales, whether they're in Scotland, whether they're in London, the people in power are the people who also have economic power. And as long as the vast majority of people don't have economic power, then, you know, too much investment in these national symbols and events and things is going to become a form of legitimizing power. So I think it would be good to cultivate a kind of cool which was also anti-Scottish, or which was like maybe ironically Scottish, or had some kind of like disputatious and self-consciously contrarian relationship to Scottishness that held back as much as possible from endorsing the formal representation of the nation. So I think it's always dangerous to like over aestheticize the kind of banal nationalist icons like football teams or music or etc. etc.
Do this as an alternative question then. Do you believe that independence will give us the ability to choose our own futures, or do you believe that the culture inherent in our politics will mean that we create a copy of what is now?
Well, if devolution is anything to go by, yeah, we've just created another mini Westminster and just shift the blame back and forth to one another. But hopefully, in the process of the discussion around independence, we create our own vision, an alternative vision. I mean, I'm a socialist, right? I've never pretended I'm not. As much as Jack of the North wants to pretend it's a shock, I'm a socialist, right? Here we are. So my politics were always guided by that in a discussion around independence. And yeah, that's what I'd like to see for the future. I'm part of a group called Labour for an Indie Wales. Any Labour Party members here, please come along. I'm probably not anymore, so it doesn't matter.
Rory.
obviously, I wouldn't want anything to resemble Westminster in any way, but I do think that there's too much resistance amongst the independence movement in Scotland to using Westminster to get what we need in the long term. I think it would be entirely in our interests to exploit some of that potential to kind of threaten the British state, to get some money out of them before we leave. So, you know, we're going to build a big, beautiful independence and make the English pay for it, would be my approach. But that's obviously criticised as being too dependent and reliant on foreign subsidies. But we are reliant on foreign subsidies. It's just from multinational corporations instead of the United Kingdom. So we might as well democratically elect the country that subsidises us until we get independence. So yeah, get as much money out of them as we can, then keep it all in the country, try not to let it leave, and then break away. And obviously we should be a republic, an independent republic of local confederated councils rather than any kind of centralised state whatsoever.
Thank you, Rory. I'm just really conscious of the time. Katie, can I ask you for a few closing statements, please?
Sure. I mean, I think ultimately, in reference to the last question, you know, the independence isn't the end, right? It's like the mode to get to where you want to go. And I suppose it's like that's maybe the first step in moving towards a better, more prosperous future. I'm less optimistic than Rory that an austerity-driven sort of Tory Westminster would be able to would ever change and ever put up the money. And I think that when you think about even the sort of the devolved situation in Scotland right now, the missing piece is the monetary powers, it is the foreign relations powers, it is the power to not have nuclear weapons in Scotland's territory. Those are all things that are reserved for a reason, because that is real power. And I think that unless we, you know, I don't think independence means a better future for everybody. I think that that's something that has to be fought for afterwards.
Thank you very much, Katie. Wel, dyna ni digwyddiad ni heno yma drosodd. Mae wedi bod yn drafodaeth hynod o ddiddorol. A diolch yn ofnadwy i pawb sydd wedi cyfrannu.